would like to start talking about the North America Free Trade Agreement. So first, do you think Nafta has been a good deal for the U.S.? I mean, what are the advantages that it has brought to the American citizens, let's say?
Sure. I do think it's been beneficial to the United States. When I look back and think about what I viewed as the three sort of overarching objectives of Nafta, number one was to provide better access for U.S. companies to Mexico and Canada, and certainly for Canadian and Mexican companies to access the United States. That certainly has been the case. Number two, to strengthen and help rationalize industry in North America such that industries like the automotive industry could compete globally with other industries, automotive industries, say in Asia, for example. And the third goal, which I think gets a little bit less attention, is to provide a framework for good relations among the three North American partners outside of trade. And so when we think in the past some of the tensions and conflicts that have existed between the three countries, having a productive trading relationship, in my view, makes addressing those conflicts easier. So on those three counts, I do think NAFTA's been successful for the United States, but also successful for Canada and Mexico.
Specifically, what do you think current negotiators can and should learn from the original negotiations back in 1994?
Well, it's a very timely question, as you know, because as we speak here at IPADE, not a mile away, our negotiators from the U.S. and Canada and Mexico are meeting to address exactly these issues. And so there are a whole host of areas that are on the table. Some, I think, are more technical updating of the agreement to catch up with the ways that our economies have evolved since the early 1990s, having to do with telecommunications and digital trade, et cetera. Others, frankly, are more fundamental and tricky issues to get at. And as you well know, the U.S. has proposed increasing the rule of origin for the automotive industry with the objective of further consolidating and ensuring that the value that's added in North America is as high as it could possibly be. Now, the risk there is that if that threshold is too high, it's going to disrupt supply chains, because although the North American auto industry is well integrated, it still relies on parts and supplies from other parts of the world. I'm cautiously optimistic that the negotiators will find a way forward, but I think it's going to be a tough business over the next several months.
Now, you're an expert in emerging markets in Mexico. So how do you assess the Mexican business environment? What do you think are the main, let's say, strengths and weaknesses of this business environment in Mexico?
So I would put sort of the strengths in one broad category, and it has to do with the productivity of the workforce. I think that as a result of NAFTA and Mexico's own domestic reforms, the value added of the typical Mexican worker is much higher than it once was. And we see that in a lot of industries, but I come back to the automotive industry as a classic example of that. Automotive production in Mexico is a very productive industry. It's a high employment industry. It's a high value added industry. And increasingly we see Mexican factories moving up the value chain. So as you know, there's a new joint venture between Daimler and Nissan, acknowledging that Mexico is a very beneficial place to produce automotives, and a whole host of other areas. However, like many emerging markets, we have this long-standing question of institutional fragility, questions about corruption, questions about the rule of law, questions about security. That's not unique to Mexico, but it's a set of issues that have plagued many emerging markets in the Americas and around the world.
How can we work to cultivate global leaders? What changes can Mexico make to encourage this way of thinking and acting?
Well, as you well know, the Mexican industrial ecosystem is still influenced and dominated by family-owned firms, and to a lesser extent, some state-owned enterprises, or the legacy of state-owned enterprises, like Telmex would be an example. And while those industrial organization types have some strengths, they also have some weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses is relatively slow-moving innovation. So as the global economy becomes more dynamic, and as change and rapidity become the rule of the game, those big legacy organizations sometimes are not as adaptive, are not able to move as quickly and adjust. And so I think moving from some of those traditional organizational structures to more dynamic structures is certainly one avenue. And we see this already. We see evidence of this already. The question is it fast enough? Are they moving fast enough?
So there's this renewed interest in business ethics, and new legislations have been enacted in the last decade to address this issue, but we continue seeing a lot of new scandals in the corporate world globally. So what is wrong with business ethics? What can we do to improve this situation?
This is a really tricky issue, and as you point out, it's a long-standing one. It seems as if we make progress, and then that progress seems to be eroded by the scandals that you're referring to. So I'm going to separate for a moment business ethics on the one hand and corporate responsibility on the other. I think of business ethics as more of an individual trait that is influenced by the institution in which that individual may be working. So in other words, if a company is very permissive about ethics, well, then that's going to bring the worst out in people. So there is a relationship between the two. I'm a big supporter of companies going above and beyond their obligations, say, to shareholders. And I know that at IPADE, this is really part of your ethos. This is really part of who you are. What I think is very exciting is that researchers like myself are beginning to demonstrate the strategic and economic benefits of doing good. So yes, it comes from a place of moral consideration and acknowledgement of the obligations of industry and companies to society, but it turns out that's also good for business. It's good for business in a positive way because customers and suppliers want to do business with companies that are viewed as providing positive contributions to society. It's also a little bit of an insurance policy so that when things go poorly, perhaps that company's not penalized as harshly as it would be because people say, look, they're fundamentally a good company and maybe an individual made a mistake. Mm-hmm. So I think this is here to stay. I don't think this is a fad. I think this is increasingly part of what being a good corporate citizen is. And again, I know that at IPADE, this is something you take very seriously.
Yeah, so maybe we could say that there's hope, right?
There is.
Even though we have some scandals, some problems, there's a lot of work that we can do, and it will be good for the companies and good for society.
I think so. I agree with that fully.
How the NGOs are integrated in this interaction between business and capitalism? What are the role of this organization?
Yeah, so as you know, this is one of my areas of research interests, and again, an area that I think is really exciting. 20 years ago, when I first began thinking about NGOs and advocacy groups, there was a lot of tension and conflict between business and these groups. In fact, I think if you were to talk to most executives, they would say that those groups are antagonistic and they're critical and they maybe get in the way of good business. But I think both sectors have changed since then. I think on the business side, as we've already discussed, companies are opening up and realizing, yes, we'd like to do more for society, but we don't always know what to do. The NGOs, I think, have realized that, hey, companies aren't the enemy. We can work with markets and use economic incentives to try to accomplish social and environmental goals. And so we see these collaborative arrangements between companies and NGOs in ways that the partnership can accomplish something that neither individual entity could on its own.
The environment is not always so good. So now with this rise of, let's say, anti-globalization and nationalistic sentiments, what steps can be taken to move towards a more equitable global capitalism?
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to education. I do think that among certain sectors of society, there are just fundamental misunderstandings about migration, about trade, about investment, about globalization, about integration. Most economists have shown that the problem or the challenge for traditional industry, say in the United States and Europe, is not about globalization, it's about technology. It's that technology is helping us become more efficient, so we need fewer workers to produce the same amount of goods. It's a myth that manufacturing in the United States has declined. It hasn't. We're manufacturing more than we ever were, but we're using fewer workers for that same amount of manufacturing, for more manufacturing. So what do we need to do? We need to retrain those workers for other kinds of jobs, in healthcare, in technology. And so education is important in terms of helping people to better understand the realities and the challenges of globalization and related issues of migration and immigration. Education is also important to address those that may be displaced by mostly technology and maybe a little globalization. So information and knowledge and education, I think, is the key to try to get around this challenging place we find ourselves in terms of support for trade, support for globalization, support for openness.
Okay, I would like to ask you one more question. You mentioned historical foundations to be differentiators in growing countries. How about culture and values to make an impact in underdeveloped countries?
Yeah, I think, culture is kind of a two-edged sword. It can be a great source of strength and resource and capability, but can also hold maybe societies back. I think that having the ability to integrate and leverage the best part of different cultures is the key. And in my presentation today, I'll talk a little bit about Carlos Ghosn, the chairman and CEO of Nissan and Renault. So here's a guy who has a multicultural background, who is heading up two different auto companies, Nissan in Japan, Renault in France. And he says, I want to draw from and leverage the best of what Japanese engineering and operational excellence and efficiency has to offer. And our French side is about design and creativity and the future. And if I can get those two pieces working together, I have the best combination. I have what I need to produce world-class automotive products for the 21st century. And I think that's a good lesson for us all. It's not that any one culture is better or worse than another. Each has something to add, but sometimes we have to draw from different cultures in order to arrive at the best outcome.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
I think it's been very enlightening.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. My pleasure to be here at IPADE.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.